panelists. All right, we've got Nick, Brandon, and Jasiri. So if we've got any questions for them, please go ahead and throw up some hands and we can start asking.
Hello. This question is for Dr. Marx. So correct me if I'm biased in my opinion. It seems like that right comedy that you spoke about, they use a lot of hateful, rude, and just offensive speech. Why have they become like the loudest in the room? And why does it resonate with so many people?
I want to make sure I got your question right. Can you repeat the last part? Why have they become the loudest in the room? And
Yes, that it sounds like they've become one of the loudest in the room, and why are they resonating with so many people?
yeah, it's a great question. I think the majority of these performers are grifters. I think they see an economic opportunity to meet a market demand in much the same way Trump did, in much the same way so many right-wing people whose job it is to appear on a camera and get advertising dollars spent, drive ratings. I can't say for certain whether Greg Gutfeld believes the stuff that he says and jokes about. Maybe he does. Joe Rogan, maybe he does. He's high and drunk half the time if you watch his show. I do know that he knows how to hold captive an audience and sell that audience to Spotify advertisers, right? 10, 11 million streamers per episode. So they, like Rush Limbaugh, generations before them, going back to repeal of the Fairness Doctrine when right-wing radio sort of rose up in the 80s, these people are performers, and they're good at sort of saying the things they know will attract eyeballs and listeners. And they've only just recently discovered that comedy is part of that market too, that trying to be funny, though they fail, trying to make humorous appeals is part of attracting those eyeballs and those listeners.
If I can just touch on that, I mean, it's also happening in hip-hop with like the emergence of what they call MAGA rap. And I think like oh yeah, it's MAGA rap. Yeah, I mean, if you want to, I mean, it's terrible, but they're getting views, right? You would say like Ben Shapiro.
Tom McDonald is,
They did video, they got like millions of views, right? And so it's a piece around like these culture wars, and it's one of the, it's an issue that I have sometimes because I was like the political rapper at one time, and because of our organizing, we're often in progressive spaces that I like don't want to invest in culture, but want to utilize like celebrities for them. And so we're, waiting, everybody's courting Taylor Swift now, and what party is she going into? Instead of really thinking about like where are people at, who's moving the culture forward, and how do we invest in folks that oftentimes agree with a lot of these ideals anyway, just based on our own lived experiences. And so I just always advocate for more support of like cultural institutions and cultural work, because Trump was just at SneakerCon, right? And again, that's another cultural piece where there are a lot of people working there that are influential that could be supported.
Great. Any more questions?
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Daphne with Open Society Foundations, and I'm curious how you, especially with things like showing like a film screening, for example, that it's meant to raise awareness and start conversations and get people thinking, how do you ensure that that awareness and even entertainment actually translates into action? We saw some examples with the work that One Hood was doing with immediately getting people to register to vote, for example. But even there's a lot of disaffection, disappointment, feelings that voting doesn't change anything. And I mean, we see in Pittsburgh, you've got some examples that it does, that people's voices do matter. But in communities, especially where maybe people are not so sure, not so convinced, let's say, with some of these actions, how do you really get people to go from that moment of, wow, that was really fascinating to watch, or wow, I had a really good time at this event, to actually building on that momentum and translating it into action?
I can say for me, I'm a filmmaker. I'm not this film took 5 years to make, and each film I've made takes 5 years to make. So it's like you get to the finish line, and we had an impact team that was working on this campaign, and I think the most important thing for us was to create the partnerships with local organizations that were working on these issues at the state and local level. So for this film, what we realized is the way it can be most effective in particular is in states and in communities where bipartisan coalitions are required to advance reform. So where you can't pass criminal justice or anything on these issues unless you have conservatives and progressives aligned. And so we partnered, we did a lot of research. The producers that worked on the impact campaign did a lot of research to find organizations where they felt showing a film that modeled bipartisanship and where they could show it to people on both sides of the aisle would be a really helpful organizing tool for them, so that they could then incentivize a kind of dialogue, get people signed up for activations, get people to vote differently, and as far as measuring the impact and making sure that led to political victories or different outcomes in those communities, that's part of what I think David and the team at CMSI was looking at, and really did interviews with they talked to pretty much every organization. We partnered with over 50 to determine, how did the film actually help them in their organizing efforts. So I'm looking forward to the outcomes of the study too. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, and I would say for us, I think first we begin as community servants, right? I think I think sometimes when we engage people politically, we'll show up every 4 years and knock on the door, or every election time and knock on the door, and it becomes very transactional, right? Like, I want you to do this for me and my candidate. A lot of what we do is really, in terms of the community, organizers pouring into the community. One example is, I live in a community in Pittsburgh called East Liberty that I tell people is like a formerly black neighborhood, and so they built a Target, a Whole Foods, and so there's still a black community there, and they built this new park. And so as black people were coming into the park, police were coming in, or, it's summertime. You ain't got nothing to do, you go to Target. Are you shopping? No, I wasn't shopping when I went to the mall. I ain't had no money. So then Target calls the police. The police would kick these young people out. And then at one point they had them had them surrounding the park. So we went there, and Jasmine, our director of education, was like, hey, can we do something in this park? So we started a program where every Friday we went to the park. We had our DJ. We had a black-owned food truck. This year we had a black-owned ice cream truck. And we just pull up with music, with food, with ice cream. We had activities like Carnegie Library came in, was giving away books. We had a magician this year, just, you know what I'm saying? And so now we have a deeper relationship and bond with that community where they know us. We're there every Friday. They appreciate us when they come out, and it's like, nah, everything's free. Go help yourself. So now when we say, hey, we have this election, it's a little bit different, right? Because we're not just having a transactional relationship. We like to have a real relationship because we're in community and building community with them. And I think that's what we've been able to do culturally in the city. So now when we say, hey, here are some people, and then the last thing we do is we do scorecards. So we don't just say vote for this person. We actually have a list of questions around issues that we believe in, and then we grade those politicians. So the year that Gainey became mayor, in the primary it was him versus 3 white candidates, all white men. And our scorecard read Ed Gainey 97%. These other 3 were all no response. And it was despite us being an organization that had been in Pittsburgh since 2006, they felt like they didn't even have to respond to our scorecard. And so when we put that out and said, these are people that are saying they want to unite the city, they couldn't even respond to us. And so that's kind of how we've been able to kind of get some action going.
I just wanted to say one other thing, just to give a specific concrete example. In Arizona, this is just an example, we partnered with Americans for Prosperity, which is funded by the Koch brothers, and the ACLU Arizona. So they were the 2 presenting partners of our screenings across the state, and both brought out their communities. They'd never partnered on a screening before, and that's the kind of coalition building we were seeking in the Impact campaign.
Great. We've got a few more questions over here and one ready to go right here.
I'm Trace Wilkins, and my question is for One Hood. I'm, first of all, just so impressed with how much you've achieved, and I think everyone needs to give applause to your work.
I thought you were going to say give money. I was like, oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
So this is a two-part question. The first question is, how long does it take to really engage your state, your community, your city? Because you've demonstrated that you've gone way beyond just a city.
Yeah, I think I would say, like, I wouldn't focus on the length. I would focus on, like, the authenticity of what you're trying to do. Like, if you genuinely want to help, I think you can kind of hop in, right? I'm not originally from Pittsburgh. I'm from the South Side of Chicago, although I got to Pittsburgh as a teenager. But I think, like, part of why, I wanted to start One Hood is, like, I was traveling all over the country as an artist, but I would come back to inner city Pittsburgh, traditionally like the poorest inner city community in the country. And so I just felt like, okay, I want to help younger artists. I didn't think I was special. I was able to connect on the internet, and I was like, oh, I can show other younger artists how to do this and how to do it for themselves. And so I think first, like, coming in, like, authentically and want to help, but also, like, not with, like, a savior complex. Because I actually kind of, even myself, like, I was like, I'm a teacher. I remember when we first started our media academy, I was like, man, I'm going to school these young people. And I was showing this video, and this was around Occupy. And one of the young people said, well, Jasiri, this is just an oligarchy anyway. And I was like, how you know that word? What? Oh, damn. So I realized, like, oh, all we really have to do is kind of create a platform and move out of the way. So I think, like, first, like, how like, do you really want to help? And have a real love for that community. And I think once you go in with those real intentions about, like, really helping, I think it could come faster than you necessarily could think. I say that to say, like our community has changed over the years. In 2020, when folks came out to the protests, a lot of the people that came out were new. They didn't know One Hood. They didn't know me. People were like, you rap? I was like, yeah, I had a whole career of doing. So, like, you're almost like you're a lot of times you're reintroducing yourself to people as your folks, your net gets wider. But I think what we've been able to do is try to remain authentic, like, lead with love, lead with compassion, lead with the idea of, like, we don't want to be the only organization. We want to go at this with other folks. We want to expand the field. And I think that's part of why we've been able to have success, because we really have a real care and concern and compassion for the communities that we work with. We're not grifters like, some of these people that kind of can come in. And so I think that's been part of why we've had success. So I think if you have that mentality, I think it's more about that than necessarily, like, the length of time. Is what I'm saying? It's like, what do you really want to accomplish? And are you willing to share those spaces, share those resources, share those mics, and make space for folks that might not have had space before? And you'll be surprised at how quickly you can gain success and love and support from folks. So that's what we're thinking about right now. And I'm going to be honest, I don't know. I didn't want to do it right away. We had like San Diego kind of reached out to us, which again is a very different demographically community than Pittsburgh, and also Brooklyn. And we're talking about more so like Flatbush, East New York, Brownsville area, and Brooklyn. And so we're trying to look at, like, how do we do it authentically? We actually are working with a consultant now about, like, how do we do it? Who has to go? What part of our model do we go with first? And so I think all of these things we're looking at as we're continuing to grow in kind of Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania. Philadelphia is another place with a possibility of, like, a One Hood pilot. So we're thinking about that right now. but just want to make sure that, one, we do it authentically, and two, we're not overburdening the staff that we currently have, and making sure that, like, if we need to hire folks, we making sure, like, folks are getting paid what they need to be paid, all of those things. So we're working on it right now, so we'll see if we're able to do it.
Amazing. We've got one more question right here.
Oh, hot. What? Who? Hi, my name is Francis Ramirez O'Shea, and I'm a documentarian in DC. And thank you, all three of you, for your great presentations. I wish I could ask you all questions. Right now, I'm working on a documentary about Black women and breast cancer. And one of the biggest aspects about it is impact. And I was really interested in, Brendan, what you were saying about, you put together these panels. I was curious, how did you put together those panels? How did you bring, I'm assuming you have people from both sides, like how did you bring these people together and what you came out up at the end? And then I'll ask the last question as well for Jasiri X was, you said you're winning in Pittsburgh. How did you figure out which storytelling methodology was working the best for which group, for which part of the communities?
I'll do my best to answer, although my brother who produced the film really is, I'm happy to connect you with him. He was really the architect of the whole campaign. You know, when we were working on this film, this is the same with our last film as well, you know, we're following Van and this coalition, and you wind up intersecting with dozens of organizations and advocates and politicians and leaders, and, you know, your number one objective is, how do I tell this story? How do I build access? How do I research and understand and build these relationships? But while we're doing that, we're continuing to cultivate relationships with all of those different people and organizations throughout the 5 years of shooting and editing the film, so that when you reach the end point, you're not starting from scratch. You've already met a lot of these people. We're building databases. We're keeping in touch with people. As we have rough cut screenings, we're inviting some of them out to see cuts of the film, building their buy-in to the project, so that when you finally premiere the film and are beginning to have an impact campaign and build that, you're not going to people cold. You're reaching out to them, and then each one of those contacts, they have their own networks, and so that's really how we built the coalition. And then there's a few national partners like the Reform Alliance, which I saw was in actually some of your videos, so I'm curious, I think we have some overlap there. The Reform Alliance and Dream.org, these are two national organizations that Van helped start that have local organizations that are members. The Empathy Network is a network of organizations all across the country working on bridge building. So we built relationship with national partners that just had a lot of local groups, and for us, the local partners were really the most important. The only reason we were able to get a good turnout at these screenings is because they were partnerships from the ground up with these organizations. So that's how we built it.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of cities have like Black doctor nurse networks. Pittsburgh, we have the Gateway Medical Society, which is a society of Black doctors and nurses, and that could be also, those could be some great folks to kind of connect with. As far as like telling our stories, I mean, I guess the example that I feel like we really didn't become one-hit media until 2020. And in 2020, when all hell broke loose with the pandemic, Pittsburgh started to host a series of town halls, and they were all white people. And so we created our own town hall called What Black Pittsburgh Needs to Know about COVID-19. And it just took off in the city in a way that I was surprised at like how many people were watching live, how many people were sharing it. And so even after COVID, we just took the COVID-19 off and called What Black Pittsburgh Needs to Know. And it kind of became like a phenomenon in the city. People were like, oh, it's like Pittsburgh's BET. And we were just streaming this on Facebook and YouTube at the same time. We also we got with this coalition of Black doctors and did Ask a Black Doctor about COVID-19. And you were able to kind of come in with your questions and ask doctors as a lot of misinformation was happening. And so as we were, and then we brought in This Week in White Supremacy podcast. And so like we kind of began to look at our Facebook page like a channel. You know what I'm saying? And if you really look at like, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, or X, I don't know what it's, Yeah, I don't like it being called expert. No, I'm just, but they're like channels, right? They're competing with for your eyes, like cable is competing with your eyes or anything else. And so now TikTok is a huge channel, right? And so I think like for us, it's like, you know, whatever creative means, like is best able to tell our own stories. Like it was Facebook for us during the pandemic. Now, like Instagram has probably been the mode that we've had the most success with in terms of reaching folks. And you know, we're starting on TikTok where we have to like reformat our videos into the TikTok format. So like all of these things that we're looking at in terms of like how to tell our story. What I like about it is it began to democratize our stories. So like, you know, we don't have to go to like the New York Times, or we don't have to go to the local news channel who only want to talk about these select stories. We can tell our own thing. So the last thing we did is we took all of our storytelling and we started blackpittsburgh.com, which was, again, to tell deeper, more journalistic stories about people in Pittsburgh, artists, organizers that never get stories told about us in like mainstream papers. One of the weird things about Pittsburgh is both of our major papers are owned by historically racist families. The Block family and the Scaife family own the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, whose writers have been on strike for over a year, and the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review. And so for us, it was almost like a matter of survival to create a place to tell our own stories.
Amazing, great. Do you have any more questions on this side, over here? Great.
Hi, Audrey Williams. I'm at the Carter School of Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. I have two questions, but I'll try to be very straightforward because I know that can be annoying. But I have a question first for Nick. I was curious, when you're looking at this type of humor and comedy, does it always require that enemy other? Is there any comedy you're seeing that's organized, you know, not necessarily about like, you know, good things about the other, but more just around positive emotions? Or is it always just kind of that very conflictual type, of comedy?
No, it's always othering. It is comedy built entirely on ownership of the loony libs. That's why there's not much generically familiar about like a setup and a punchline, for instance, or the wonderful stand-up routines that we saw last night. There's not a lot of conventional storytelling either. It's all about what's in the news today. Look how ridiculous this is. Doesn't this threaten you? Doesn't that bring up the same sort of aggrieved resentment of this other that you've long harbored, and now we're expressing it in a way that gives you permission to laugh at it and provides some relief that way. So there's lots of great comedy out there from across the ideological spectrum, but this stuff that's filtering up to the mainstream and right-wing worlds is purely about othering and laughing at. Yeah.
I guess that's pretty straightforward, but it seemed too simple, so yeah, thank you. And then Jasiri, I really appreciated how you talked about how you all were doing this work, you know, far before the concept of narrative change kind of got energy. And I was just wondering, you know, since we call it narrative change now, I'm sure it'll be called in any sort of different thing in the future, but what is it that music can do in this space that it might do differently than other sorts of media?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, you know, I almost look at like hip hop and rap music as like this kind of secondary or adopted thing when it's the #1 music genre on the planet. People don't even know that. Like the most streamed #1 genre is rap music. And, but again, I think oftentimes the way we look at it is we'll wait for artists to emerge that we can kind of latch on to. I think there's so much can be done about if we begin to develop our own artists. This is kind of part of when we started to do the Media Academy was because I was in a high school classroom with Wiz Khalifa. And he was a different type of rapper in that classroom. You know, his name Khalifa comes from his grandfather who just recently passed away. Brother Jabril was a very well-known Muslim organizer in the city of Pittsburgh. And so, but when to get from that classroom to international stardom, he was supported by and 100% people from outside of our community. that poured resources into him. So I would always tell people like, well, who does he owe? Does he owe us? Where we're like, you know, a rapper, you'll never be a rapper, get out of here. And there were people from outside of our community that actually gave him resources. And so as we started to develop One Hood Media Academy, it was really like, what if we were to identify artists and give them resources and kind of connect them to our community, like what Black Star is doing with filmmakers in Philadelphia? Now it doesn't have, like, you naturally have a connection to that community because that community also invested in you. And so to me, it's just, you know, you look at a song like, you know, All Right by Kendrick Lamar that becomes adopted as this, like, it becomes part of a movement. This is what music can do. You know, the first song that I did was called Free the Gina 6. I put it on my MySpace page, if you remember MySpace. And it became the theme of the movement to free these 6 young men who were arrested for a fight in high school. One man, Michael Bell, was given a 10-year prison sentence for a high school fight. And so I make this song, and it becomes this theme, and 70,000 people show up in Gina, Louisiana, and it like led to the release of the dropping of the charges, and now Michael Bell is a lawyer. And so for me, I was somebody that was told nobody wanted to hear conscious rap. Remember, this was early 2000s. This was Bow Wow was like running. So I was told that, like, no one wants to hear this. I put this song on MySpace page. It's played all over the country, and it led to actual change, right? And, you know, so then by the time I get to the song around Trayvon, I do that song and video in collaboration with Color of Change. The video actually features a sign this petition to get charges put on George Zimmerman, which ended up happening even though he was found not guilty. But so I think there's such a large way we can use music and develop our own acts that speak to the real issues. And I just, you know, I wish we think about that more in terms of the benefits we have, like culturally, that we can do to kind of move the needle.
I did want to butt in here for a second. I do have a question for Nick that I think dovetails with the last one you were asked. I'm going to start by paraphrasing my friend comedian Jay Jordan, who says a lot of people call themselves comedians, but not a lot of them know how to tell a joke, which is a little gatekeepy, but it's funnier when he says it. Looking at a lot of these right-wing comedians, it strikes me that at least structurally, and you touched on this, it doesn't really look like comedy. We're not getting like pattern recognition reversal. We're not getting set up punchline. We're getting like grievances. So one thing is I notice that a lot of what you call right-wing comedy is either televised on streaming or podcasts. So I guess part one of the question is, have you seen any right-wing comedy perform live? And the second question is, thinking a bit about what Kurt said yesterday about dog whistles and how folks can say just kidding, to what extent do you think folks on the right are using comedy as a sort of category to shield their hate speech?
Yeah, it's a great question, and believe me, I have a ton of respect for what you and folks last night did as a true practice of an art, and comedy is an art form. So I have seen some of these folks live. I've been to the Comedy Mothership in Austin, Joe Rogan's comedy club, and you know, many folks know he's a national touring stand-up comedian. He pals around with Dave Chappelle, right, former darling of the left as well, and the man has stage presence. He knows how to get up and sort of craft a story and a joke. He is the exception among many of the folks that we encountered in this right-wing comedy world, though, precisely because, as you state, Gabe, it is cover for grievance, for hate speech, the further down the sort of chain of, let's say, mainstream acceptability we go. So we begin the book by talking about these kind of high-profile folks like Greg Gutfeld and Joe Rogan, but they connect to, they have on their shows, they promote, they tweet with, they interact with in social media circles, people who can take you a few clicks away to misogynists and men's rights activists and neo-Nazis and folks that we'd really rather not acknowledge as being comedic, and so we have these other names for them, like, oh, they're trolls, right? Those are just people on 4chan, which very much they are. They're grounded in hate, but they also are engaging in playfulness, in sort of wanting to make fun of an other. And so while it might not be the type of thing that brings us pleasure on the left, it is bringing them a comedic sort of joy and pleasure to be hateful, to sort of other a group that they view as an enemy and as a threat.
It definitely feels very like childish school ground kind of. It's like that's the sort of comedy that
Totally.
kids engage in before they become compassionate, if they do at all.
Can I ask you a question, Nick, as well? You know, you just had the return of like Jon Stewart to the Daily Show, and I guess his first foray into that got pushed back from like both sides because he was critical of. I mean, the man is 81, but Joe Biden as well. So just like how do you see that in terms of here's like, is it, you know, should you just only like beat up on the right? Like, should there be like this wing of left wing comics that just beat up on the right, or can somebody kind of engage in this in a more authentic way?
Yeah, I think Stewart historically, and especially in his return, is at his best when he's interrogating structures of power and not just sort of naming the politician who's made headlines that day and saying how ridiculous they are, although he's very good at that too. When he's at his best, he's naming capital and systemic racism as the sort of twin pillars of oppression to many folks. And those things can be identified in current Democratic politics, and they can be identified in current Republican politicians as well, to degrees of being worse than the other, of course. But yeah, I don't know that we need or have something as strongly polarized on the left as what I've observed on the right, but I'll continue watching and supporting the sort of mainstream voices we have, like Stewart, when he's at his best, sort of interrogating systems of power.
Awesome.
Oh. I changed my mind, but now I'm back. My name is Liz, she, her pronouns, and I'm with Reframe, which is a narrative research and action shop. And I kind of wanted to ask this group about power kind of explicitly, and thinking about what it means to have a good defense and what it means to have a good offense in the moment that we're in. So I wonder if the panel could talk a little bit about what is the defense we need to build to contend with the media infrastructure, the political infrastructure of the right, and then also what is the offense that we need to build, the long-term kind of power-building vision to sustain that, to sustain democracy, and also expand everybody's rights and move towards liberation. And I'd love to hear your all's thoughts on that.
Man, so when I think about defense, I think about like definitely like protecting the most marginalized. When you talk about like Black, queer, and trans folks, being a lot of times the most marginalized, the easiest to pick on and most able to attack. So like, how are we making sure that we're creating space and support for that community? We work a lot with the organization in Pittsburgh called Trans Uniting. In very explicit ways. I also think about, you know, and I don't remember your name, but when you were talking about policing and kind of that narrative around policing, right, where, you know, we went from talking about, you know, defunding police and how much we spend on police to now, you know, D.C. passing this crime bill, you know, New York having, you know, National Guard on the subway, and all around narrative, right? Really, as crime is going down, right? So we created we did a study around reimagined public safety where we talked about like what police actually do, right? How most of the times police are working on misdemeanor crimes. Both Philadelphia and Pittsburgh passed legislation to stop police from doing minor traffic stops, because minor traffic stops actually leads to a lot of these things. In Pittsburgh, they actually continue to do it, and they asked the assistant police chief, and he said, for officer morale. That's what he said. But it's like, that's not your job anymore. Like, we actually pass law. So I think a lot about, like, so for us, it's about making sure, like, we get that information in this study. Like, we put it in a way that's acceptable to our community. We put it in a way where we popularize a lot of like what's really going on. Like homicide is down, like violent crimes are down nationwide. But a lot of times the narrative is like if you go to any downtown, like you're just gonna be ducking gunfire. So I do think about that as somebody that's in media that talks a lot about media. I'm thinking about that a lot in terms of one, like how do we defend those individuals that are gonna be subject to being stopped when you're, being your bag being looked into. We know those are going to be black, brown, Arab folks, Muslim folks. And then it's like, what do you say now when you miss your court, because of you not even being able to use public transit? And so that's the defense. And the offensive part is like, how are we taking like real facts and getting them out there to where people actually know what's really going on and what's really happening. I think we've been able to do that well in like the Pittsburgh community, but like how do we do that on a more national scale where it's like this idea of like, it was a couple videos of people going into stores and taking stuff, and then that video is shared and it's like, oh, it's lawlessness now all over the country, and that's something that these stores have insurance for, and it's not even a big deal, and they're closing stores not because people are robbing them, because they're suffering from an economic downturn. So like, how do we get the real stuff off is oftentimes what I think, and just I think we have to be able to be better at it. And I think this is where cultural organizers and providers are better at messaging. The last thing I'll say is this. It's weird to me that like I think every organization should have artists on staff. You should have an artist on staff because it's going to make your graphics better, your storytelling better, a comedian on staff, somebody that can frame a certain thing. I just don't understand why when we go into a lot of progressive space, we don't do that. And our engagement with artists is, oh, we're going to do this event. Let's see if we can call this artist at the last minute, and we might have $150 for you. It just bothers me. So yes, those are my 2 cents.
Hey, Brandon, yeah, how about you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to answer it in the context of political documentaries, because that's what I've been making, and releasing this film, and I know I'm not alone. I'm sure there's other documentary filmmakers here, but most streaming companies, most distributors, they have very set mandates. I cannot begin to tell you how many high-level executives at major companies came back to us and said, our mandate is we will not distribute any film that is political in any way whatsoever. We just have a mandate about that. We got one notice from I'm not going to name the major company, but they said the email was literally, we as a company have a mandate that we don't do truth to power storytelling. This is being filmed, I probably should, but
Say the name. Say the name.
Schmetflix. Yeah.
So privately, I'm happy to literally, Lance and I have cataloged all the emails that we've gotten, and the defensive strategy has been that there are incredible film festivals, regional film festivals, that are just filling in this critical gap of getting stories that deal with political issues on one side, the other, dealing with the messiness of politics, that are serving this need. And communities are showing up to these screenings. The buyers and the distributors are claiming that there's not an audience, or it's going to upset one side of their audience or the other. So to me, the defensive move has been really building, really investing in regional film festivals, supporting them, impact campaigns, partnerships with local nonprofits. These have been the ways that independent documentary filmmakers are getting their films out. The offensive position that I think is more critical is, how do we, if all of the major distributors are saying we won't touch anything political, why is there not a major effort or a major company stepping in to say, okay, this company won't, this company won't. So this is the home of where you find political films. And what's, to me, that effort and that company, that institution, if anybody here wants to create it, I don't want to go through that work, but I will support you. But that feels like a really, essential offensive solution.
Real quick, offense and defense for me is, human connection and empathy. Not to be a cheesy dad, but I teach college students, and at the start of every class, I have them put away their devices for 5 minutes, turn to the person next to them, look them in the eye, and just talk. And that may be a thing that's limited to young people coming through college classrooms now, but I think rediscovering face-to-face human interaction, especially post-COVID, is so powerful and sets the stage for so many other bigger, more important conversations to happen. And you can't get that through a device. You have to sit across from another human body, look at them, and address them as a fellow human being with the same rights and hopes and desires as you might have. And so fostering that sensibility in every part of your life, I think, is super important.
If I could add one little bit to that, I'm sorry, we are running on time, but I recently had a conversation on a different project I'm working on with Katie, with Arish Makati from Pillars Fund, which works against anti-Muslim bias and hate in media. And we were talking about her work on Rami as a consultant, and she said what I loved about Rami is that it felt like finally the conversation surrounding Muslims in the US was on the offense rather than on the defense, right? Rather than responding to these post-9/11 stereotypes about terrorism, we have a show from a Muslim Arab American creator about that same community. And specifically what she said felt like it was offense, is that these characters are imperfect, they're human, they make flaws. So I think sometimes we trap ourselves by thinking that all representation needs to present people as like morally upstanding and perfect to fight against these stereotypes. But embracing the complexity and the messiness of people, I think, is a way to stop being on defense and be like, we have to be perfect or we'll be criticized, and just kind of set the terms of the conversation on your own. I'm paraphrasing her. This podcast is forthcoming, and I hope it makes the cut, because it's some really insightful stuff, but I'll send your way once it comes out. All right, cool. I think we had one more question.
We may have got to a lot of this. I'm Ross Donald. I'm a professor at American University, and I've just finished researching a documentary called The Territory, which looks at forest defenders, and then it also looks at the people who are trying to invade the forest, and they give it equal time. So and that was like a very conscious decision by the production. Like they wanted to show both sides. And then I was talking to the impact team afterwards, and they said, well, we really wanted to show that, in the areas where these farmers are living, but it was pretty unsafe. And so they were trying to think about who would be the best person to sort of do this kind of outreach work. And so I guess one question I have, the question that I'm trying to get at is when we're doing this kind of outreach to communities who are not benefiting from power structures that they're upholding, and there's also a lot of questions. But do you have ideas about how we could do that well, how you can do that safely, how you're not putting the burden on other people who are also in danger as well? I think there's a lot of attempts at bipartisanship that are kind of placating, and how can we instead do this in a way that's effective, and ways that people can kind of use power that they have to kind of do that kind of outreach. So that was very badly put, but I hope that I would love to hear what you think.
I'm trying to think about how to answer this. One thing I just want to acknowledge that I really agree with what you're saying is there is this really intense, the people that appeared in this film, the protagonists in our film, they went through something very uncomfortable, and in some of their communities, sharing this film was a very vulnerable thing for them to do. So for me, as the director of the film, I, first of all, made sure I had literally 25 one-on-one screenings with every single person that had a significant role in the film. It was a really intense process of sitting, watching the film together, listening to their questions, their concerns, and being open to their feedback. So making sure that the final product of the film, I don't believe in this idea that you finish your film and then you you just, they see it at the premiere. I just don't subscribe to that. I was mentored by the filmmakers at Kartemquin Films, and this is a primary ethic of the way they make their films, and that's how I do it. So I think that process helps people feel buy-in and ownership over the film, because even though they didn't edit the film or direct it with you, they did see it and had a point of input. And I'm seeking their input the whole time. And then in the releasing of the film, I think the biggest thing is just really listening to what they want and where they feel the film can be useful, like not sort of untethering myself from what I think the film's agenda is and what it needs to do. We intentionally made it a story that has a lot of openness, and people can come to their own conclusions and ideas. And every single screening of this film, we basically let the organizations that were presenting it, which included the 5 organizations from West Virginia and LA, they had their own screenings of the film. And we said, you take it. You pick the panelists. You pick what the discussion is going to look like. You pick the policies that you're trying to discuss and debate and push forward. And I think, it's at the end of the day, they're watching the same film, but I don't think coming in with a set agenda of how the film should be used helps at all. So that helps build their buy-in and understanding. I don't know if that specifically answered your question, but that's.
Yeah, I would. It's hard, right? Because a lot of times in those communities, media has been demonized as well. It's like to be something to be, looked at in a very negative way. I'd recommend a book. The author's name is Jonathan Metzl. He did a book called Dying of Whiteness, where he actually went, he's from Missouri. He went into these rural communities to talk to people who are voting for policies that are like literally killing them, like not wanting the Affordable Care Act because they called it Obamacare. I think he calculated that it took like 5 years off of their lives. Right, so that might give you insight into, he was able to do it as a white man, yeah. So we kind of had a conversation. I mean, I have a different view of that. Don't ask me to do it. I ain't going. But that book will probably provide you some insight into like the mentality of folks and like what folks are dealing with.
All right, great. I think that's all the time we have for this. So I really want to thank Nick Marx, Brendan Kramer, and Jasiri X for joining us on this panel. Thank you so much.